Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Dojo Dialogue. I'm excited because I had a chance this afternoon to sit down and have a great conversation with Carolyn Custis James. She is an amazing author and speaker, and I first came across her work in her book, The Gospel of Ruth, Loving God Enough to Break the Rules. And this is, not even exaggerating, the best Bible study on the book of Ruth that I've ever read. Other than some of the commentaries that she also used in writing the book, this would be the number one resource that I have actually pointed people to, particularly women. But men, this is a great book for you as well. So for years, I've appreciated her work, and she recently made a Facebook post that had to do with the gospel and what it says about patriarchy. And so I just commented, hey, this would make for a great discussion if you'd like to enter the dojo and talk about it. And she graciously agreed. So in this discussion, we talked about the book of Ruth, about the concept of patriarchy, about what that means for Christians around the world and here in America, how we look at the role of women and the role of men, how we can analyze cultural movements through a gospel lens rather than through a political or cultural lens. It was a great discussion. I think you're going to find it interesting and challenging, and whether you agree or disagree, this is the dojo. You are always free to share your thoughts in the comments section below. So before we jump into the interview, if you haven't already, we would really appreciate you subscribing. Our goal is to grow this channel, and in 2022, our goal is to reach 5,000 subscribers. So as of today, I think we're at about 3,500, give or take. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the other videos we have here at Disciple Dojo. Okay, that's enough talking from me. Let's step into the dojo. Carolyn, it is so nice to have you here through the wonders of technology, face to face, so to speak. Thank you for stepping into the dojo. We really appreciate it.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm very curious about all of the men behind you.
So yes,
on the
I am a superhero comic book pop culture nerd, and one of the playlists we have here on the channel is called Superhero Seminary, and it's where I use superhero action figures and pop culture and things from my childhood to teach biblical lessons. And you actually starred in one of our Superhero Seminary videos where Wonder Woman explained the biblical concept of helpmate and what that Hebrew term actually means. And you were the esteemed scholar that she quoted from in that episode.
Oh, wow.
So, no pressure, but Wonder Woman, that's what you have to embody here. No.
Yeah, well, you need some female figures on that little ledge you have. So
Yes, they are.
Maybe when we're finished, you'll add two.
You have to send me a few. They're just out of screen. I have Wonder Woman and She-Ra.
Yeah, I see her.
There's Cara Dune from Mandalorian and the Armorer. So, but yes, typically the action figure market skews more male. But that is part of the patriarchy, which we're going to be talking about in this discussion. And we're going to let viewers hear from you. I want to tell, so this is for those watching, your book, The Gospel of Ruth, came out in 2008, I believe. Does that sound right? I think that's about
close enough.
Yeah, somewhere around then. At least the Kindle version is, because it was one of the first books on Kindle that I ever got when I got a Kindle. And it was part of, there was some promotional, maybe Christianity Today or Zondervan or something, but there were some books that were kind of like, check these out. And so I got your book, but it was a few years actually before I read it, and it sat on my Kindle and I was reading other stuff. And then when I started to, I was going to have to be teaching through the book of Ruth, and I was like, let me read this. And I'll be honest, at first I thought, well, this is a book for women, so I don't know if it's going to be aimed at a 40-something single male Bible teacher. But let me check it out, and I read it, and it is the best book I've ever read on Ruth, like that. Not a commentary length, but book on the book of Ruth. I've recommended it to numerous women since. I've given a copy to my mom, to a friend of mine who is going through a lot of trauma and kind of living in that Naomi experience. And so it really, for those of you watching, I want you to make sure, I mean, we're going to talk about her other books as well, but her book, The Gospel of Ruth, Loving God Enough to Break the Rules, And that's what initially I want to talk to you about Ruth, and then we can transition because I want you to tell viewers about what you just have been working on recently. The thing that I found refreshing about your book is that it was intent on making Ruth not a Disney fairy tale and not a romance story in the traditional sense that it is normally presented as. And so that's what I wanted to give you a chance to talk about. There's a quote in your book. It's on page 30. I'm going to read it here, and then I'd like for you to unpack it. It says, if anything, previous characterizations of Boaz as the romantic lead, the hero of the book of Ruth who rescues Ruth from singleness in this narrative, have actually detracted from his true significance and cheated him of enormous credit he truly deserves. I know what you mean because I've read the book, but for viewers who are like, wait, what? Boaz is the hero, right? I thought this is the story about, King David's great-great-grandfather or whatever. What do you mean by that, the traditional understanding, and how does it detract from his true character?
Well, actually, I grew up on the Cinderella version of the Book of Ruth, and I love that story. I'm a pastor's daughter, so I grew up in the church, and it was a Bible church. As soon as we could, we were all reading our Bibles through every year, and so I knew this story as well as my own, and how wonderful it was that Ruth and Boaz got married, but I never could accept the happily ever after. The Bible doesn't teach us happily ever after. The Bible talks a lot about struggle and stories that don't work out beautifully in the end. But when I started hearing what scholars were saying more recently in their research into the Book of Ruth, it went off like a bomb in my life. And it made me realize that all three of the characters in this story, the main ones, are cheated of the true credit that they get for what they do, what the actions and sacrifices they make. And, I think we have to really look at Boaz. He's introduced as a man of stature. And, so after all the men in the story, Naomi's husband and her two sons, one of whom is the husband of Ruth, all die. And the women are left without husbands, and they're in a foreign land because Naomi's family has fled a famine in Bethlehem and gone to Moab, and with her husband and two sons, where the two sons end up marrying Moabite girls. And then, the very thing they're fleeing, because famines are deadly, death meets them there. And her husband dies, and her sons marry pagan girls, and then both of them die. And the men are swept off the stage. And if you had asked the women in the story, so what's the story now, they would both tell you there is no story here. But the biblical camera zooms in on these childless widows, and that's when the real story begins. And readers, when they get to chapter 2 and they read that about Boaz is introduced into the story, it's sort of like, the hero is here, and the rescue is going to happen, and all this tragic story is going to turn out well in the end because he's the hero. One of the things that changed for me when I started hearing deeper interpretations that were coming from scholars who were, their hermeneutical tools were improving. And so instead of just looking at this Hebrew word and that Hebrew word and, maybe, what kind of food the people ate and how they gleaned in the fields and, what kinds of things were happening in the story, they actually looked at this as a piece of literature. They look at it as a story that is beautifully and artistically woven together. When we look at it, we have chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4, and the pieces all get lost in, because we're rushing to this happily ever after. Scholars were saying this is the story of a female Job, that it's Naomi's story, that Ruth is the one who is initiating the action, and that Boaz is responding to her initiatives. And I'm sitting in a classroom where I was waiting to hear a lecture on the book of Ruth from Dr. Bruce Walke, who is a good friend of mine. And I was internally rolling my eyes because I thought there's nothing new about this one. I know this one. And when he started talking like that, it went off like a bomb in my life, because I grew up thinking the word initiate didn't belong in my vocabulary because I was female, that I was to be responding and following, and that I wasn't to be initiating or leading. But these scholars are saying she's taking agency. She's deciding to go to Bethlehem against her mother-in-law's wishes and against common sense. And she's the one who approaches Boaz with the initiative about gleaning and the initiative about marriage and the kinsman redeemer and levirate laws. And Boaz, who knows the law, was raised on it, is listening to someone who sees beyond the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. And he gets it. And, we think he's the hero of the story, but in order to be a man of stature in a full-fledged patriarchal culture, he had to have been a married man with sons of his own. I read a book recently that was written by a Jewish journalist who researched life in the Middle East, and she ran across a Palestinian man whose wife gave birth to a daughter, and then she couldn't get pregnant again. And he was beside himself. He said, I am nothing in this village without a son. So one of the things that changes how we look at Boaz and how we look at Ruth and Naomi and how we look at all the narratives in the Bible is for us to put patriarchy in its place, because this is a patriarchal culture. And we're in 21st century America, which is vastly different from the patriarchal world. I mean, we've tried to salvage elements of patriarchy. But, this is nothing like patriarchy, the way we live in America. So under patriarchy means father rule. Patriarchy established power with men. It gave fathers power over their sons and daughters. It gave the firstborn son power over his siblings. Primogeniture is the rights of the firstborn. It gave men power over women and children and also over other men. More men are under the thumb of patriarchy than empowered by it. And so that's the world. And it was a world where a woman's value was gauged by her relationships with men. Who's her father? Who's her husband? How many sons has she produced? And women in the Bible who can't get pregnant aren't begging God for daughters. None of them are. They want sons. And so Naomi has two sons, so she can hold her head up high. And when her sons die and she's widowed and she's past childbearing years, you gauged a woman's value by counting her sons. Naomi is a zero in the culture's eyes. And so is Ruth. Even worse, she becomes an immigrant in Israel, so she drops below zero.
She's a Moabite.
Boaz,
Yeah, a Moabite.
yeah,
They weren't even allowed in the
yeah,
assembly
yeah.
for X number of generations.
So and when Boaz sets foot on the stage and he's introduced as a man of stature, he has done his duty for his family. He is a father of sons. And he stands tall in the community, and we find out in the end of this story just how very powerful a man he is. But what happens to him is he encounters a young, brand new convert who lives on the hungry side of the law. And the law reads differently from that point of view. The law says, the gleaning law says, let them glean. Let the widow, the orphan, let them glean. But that means let them into the field after you've cleared your crops for whatever's there. The letter of the law says, let them glean, but the spirit of the law says, feed them. And Ruth doesn't want to take home scraps to her despairing mother-in-law. And so she asks to break the rules. They're supposed to glean after the harvesters cut down all the grain and the women bundle it up and it's carried off to the threshing floor. She wants to glean behind the sheaves that have just been cut. And Boaz gets it. And she goes home that night with 29 pounds of winnowed barley. According to ancient Babylonian records, it would take a male harvester a half a month or a full month to take home that much in pay. So it was massive what he was doing just in that first episode. Boaz is, for my money, one of the greatest men in the Old Testament. And he's influenced by a Gentile. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's laughable. I mean, she was risking her life. If you look at places like Afghanistan, where if a woman is alone in that culture, what can happen to her? And who will stand up for her if she doesn't have a father or a brother or a husband or a son? And that's what these women were utterly vulnerable. And Naomi knew it. They were toast. Mm-hmm. And there was no future in Bethlehem. There was only going to be danger and suffering and abuse and who knows what all. Mm-hmm. And then there is this man called Boaz, who's a different kind of man.
Yeah,
so
Boaz,
yes, he gets cheated when he's Lothario, the romantic figure who, right. And what's he doing as a very powerful man to be looking at an impoverished immigrant scavenging in his field with romantic intentions? What kind of, that's creepy,
The book of Ruth gets brought up. So I'm I've done most ministry to a lot of Christian singles, and I'm single myself and never married. And there's the story of Ruth is fascinating to me of how it gets presented in ways that are completely at odds with what you actually read in the text, which is what I liked about your book, is it points these ways out. You mentioned Naomi is the one who Naomi encourages Ruth to pursue Boaz, because obviously Ruth, I think exactly what you're saying, she's like, I'm a Moabite, so already detested in this country. I'm poor, I'm a widow, I've got nothing, and this is like the big guy in town, the man of stature, everybody knows him, and he has a good reputation. Why would he ever talk to, so it doesn't make sense to look at it, that she would be looking at it through the eyes of like, I'm going to initiate a romance. But Naomi is like, no, I know his character, and she's like, you need to do, when she sees what he gives her back, his character is revealed through his generosity to the poor. and his generosity to the immigrant and his generosity to the widow and to the ones at the margins of society. And he shows it by literally giving them food and saying, here, take this back, feed Naomi, feed your mother-in-law. It's a powerful instance.
So if he's in love with her, why doesn't he send her home and say, you don't ever have to come back here again. I'm going to send my harvester around with a load for you, and you'll have food all the time. Why, I mean, it's very hard to justify any romantic interest he would have in her as a man of stature. Yeah. Marriages under patriarchy are arranged to benefit the family, and this is just not going to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he's if he's not married with sons of his own, I mean, maybe he's widowed or not, but this is a polygamous culture. He could have 3 wives for all we know. And if he hasn't produced sons, then he would be a grief and a shame to his family. And I think that this is where we have to look again at patriarchy, because my thesis, where I've landed on patriarchy, is that patriarchy, when we study the Bible, patriarchy matters. And we need to understand it if we're going to understand these stories. Because here's what I landed on when it comes to interpreting these narratives. Boaz is not the hero of this story. If you're going to have a hero of this story, it's going to be Ruth. But the hero of the story is always Yahweh. God is the hero. And this is a story about a woman who's lost everything. And she is convinced that God no longer loves her. The key word in the book of Ruth is the Hebrew word hesed, which is God's self-giving love for his people. And it's the kind of love that all 3 of these characters end up displaying for each other. It calls for sacrifice, and it calls for putting the interests of others ahead of yourself. And so Naomi thinks she's Job. She's a Job figure. She doesn't believe he loves her. She thinks he's raised his hand against her, that he's her enemy, and she's embittered by that. And this load of grain that Ruth brings home is what turns the tide for Naomi. And she says, he has not forgotten his hesed for the living and for the dead. So even her husband and her sons are not forgotten.
Yeah, and it's tied to that physical gift of grain. Sparks. It's fascinating to me. It's a gift that somebody would say, well, it's just charity. I mean, it was, but you mentioned, why would Boaz not just say, go home and never work again? That to me, that's one of the beauties of the book is Boaz and Ruth. The fact that he's letting her glean and telling his workers, hey, don't just let her glean, pull out some extra sheaves, make sure she's taken care of, but in a way that's not just handing down. It's giving her.
She's working.
She's producing with her hands. So what she got is a gift, but it's also something that she worked for. And I see that as both of them. The book of Ruth gives honor to both people. And in the eyes of the culture, in the eyes of each other, in the eyes of God, there's just so much overflowing. And that's what you said. That's chesed. That's the epitome of chesed, is this undeserved, unmerited grace that expresses itself in tangible support. And that's what changes Naomi's whole, she's not, don't call me bitter anymore. Like God's actually doing something, and she's starting to see the light. She
knows she's loved when she gets that. Look, it's excessive, and even Ruth brings home cooked grain. So there's fast food meal, first fast food meal in the Bible. But it's, it is absolutely extraordinary, especially when you consider he's coming out of a famine. He's in economic recovery, and he's being this generous. Where I've landed in how I look at these narratives is, first of all, to always remind myself that God is the hero of the story, that the book of Ruth is about God. It's about God's love. It's about his purposes. It's about his freedom to use anyone he chooses to advance his purposes for the world, and that he can do it through the most covert, unexpected ways. None of three of them ever knew what God was actually doing for the world through their sacrifices. And so God is always the hero of the story. And that as Americans, when we open our Bibles, we have to tell ourselves again and again, we are not reading an American book. And when we look at it through an American lens, we're going to end up with Cinderella. And that's not what the Bible teaches us, ever. All the way through. We're not promised prosperity and, sailing into the future with everything we ever dreamed of. We're told we'll suffer and that we have to make sacrifices. And, so it's that. And so we need to understand patriarchy. We need to understand that this is a world where men are empowered, that it empowers men and it disempowers women. And yet in this story, God is empowering the women, and the man who has the power uses his power in sacrificial ways to advance the good of other people. So he doesn't shed his power or his privilege. He uses it. How do you shed your power? How would a man do that? But men all through the Bible, including Jesus, use their power. They use it. It's a gift from God. He entrusts power to his image bearers in Genesis 1, not for selfish ends, but for hesed, to use your power the way God uses his power, to bless and to do good. So, Boaz is amazing.
And what you point out in the book is that Boaz, he is a good man, and Ruth coming along and, Ruth straight up proposes to Boaz in ancient cultural terms and basically says, marry me. And, but in a way that's culturally couched enough to avoid wanton impropriety, but is still appointed. He's getting the message and it's not going to be mistaken. And there's a whole discussion about that in the book, in your book, as well as when we teach through here in the podcast. So I encourage viewers to check that out. But the thing that on page 205 of your book is you say, Boaz, a truly good man, becomes a better man because of Ruth. And I agree. I think a good man and a good godly woman, they're both men of chayil, a woman of chayil and a man of chayil. Strength is how it's often translated. And both of them are described that way. And so it's like two godly people, one Gentile, immigrant, widow, poor, destitute, and one has everything on a platter, seemingly, and they come together. They both make each other better. And the whole book of Ruth is so interesting, is it's so mundane. It's about picking grain in a field and getting married, but yet that is the origin of the greatest king in Israel's history up until Jesus. So it's like God's telling this vast cosmic story through the lens of this ancient Near East agricultural account. And there's so much in it that... Go ahead. What were you saying?
No, but I called this book The Gospel of Ruth because it is the gospel. And, the threshing floor scene is very confusing to 21st century Americans, but it is saturated with Mosaic law, and it's saturated with sacrifice. And all three of the main characters are making huge sacrifices in that in that encounter. You know, Ruth is not looking for a husband for herself. She is demonstrably barren. She's had 10 years of marriage without a son, without a girl, without a daughter. But Naomi knows that Ruth is going to outlive her, and she will be stranded in Bethlehem as an immigrant. And she wants to get her under a male umbrella. And so what Naomi is doing is giving up everything she has when she gives up Ruth. But she wants her to be protected. That's, you know, and the first readers of this story would not blink at the thought that, you know, Boaz, who has to have had sons, whether he's widowed or whatever, that this is a polygamous culture. Nobody would blink at him adding a wife. And, you know, they did more than that following him in biblical narratives. But Ruth is going to Boaz not looking for shelter. She's throwing the book at him. She's throwing the kinsman redeemer law and the levirate law at him. Mm-hmm. And she's proven herself to be infertile. So it's a huge risk for her, but she wants, as kinsman redeemer, the nearest relative is obligated to purchase the dead man's land. So she's talking about real estate, and so is he. He talks about Naomi is selling her land, and the nearer relative would probably inherit it without any action because there's no male heir in Naomi's family. So it's, you know, that's why I say loving God enough to break the rules. They're breaking the law of God open so that they're going beyond the letter of the law. And to produce a male heir for Naomi's dead husband is for a blood brother to do that. That's what the levirate law says. And Boaz is none of these. He's completely within the letter of the law. But Ruth's interactions with him point to the spirit of the law. And he gets that. And so Ruth is, though she is barren, she is volunteering to bear a son. I mean, she's putting that whole painful narrative back in action. If she doesn't get pregnant, it'll just be more of the same nightmare. And Boaz is being asked to take from his own son's inheritance to invest in Elimelech's land. And if Ruth gives birth to a son, that will be Elimelech's heir, and it will be a losing investment for Boaz. I mean, everybody is making sacrifice. It's the gospel. Yeah. The threshing floor scene is an Old Testament prefiguring of Jesus' gospel, because all three of them are making sacrifices for the others.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't make sense in the eyes of that culture what Boaz would do. And Boaz doesn't have any promise that anyone will ever remember. You know, it's like we read this from our end of history, knowing this is Jesus's lineage. This is David's great grandparents. Yeah, but at the time, Boaz has none of that, no concept of that. He's just, I like what you said. I had our first guest we ever had on the Disciple Dojo for one of these discussions was Carmen Imes, and a phenomenal Old Testament scholar and just a wonderful friend of mine. And we talked about the beauty of the law, and her book, Why Sinai Still Matters. The beauty of the law is the law provided not rule by rule by rule. If you follow it, everything's good. The law gave you opportunity to have a relational and a faith-filled walk with God. So to me, the paramount example of that is the law of gleaning, where the law just says, leave the edge of your field and let the widow and the orphan and the immigrant come through. It never says how much of the edge. So it gives you a chance. Are you going to just keep the bare minimum and be a miser and leave one row of grain? Or are you going to be like, hey, this law is for the benefit of the people who need it. Let me be as generous and responsibly as I can, and let me provide for those who don't have the means, but not just handouts. They have to glean, they have to work, they have to come get it. But I'm going to use, like you said, I'm going to use my power to provide means for other people to do what God's economy has set up. And I think you're absolutely right. Boaz sees beyond what's the requirement of the law, and he sees to what's the spirit of the law. And that's, to me, and Ruth and Naomi both as well, all three of them just epitomize. This is why the book's so fascinating to me as an Old Testament teacher, is it shows Christians, hey, the gospel is in the law. God's grace is in the law. Hesed is in the law, because the law is not just do this, do this, do this, and everything's fine. It provides that chance of grace.
The point you make, that a load of grain is so ordinary. Everything in this story really is just mundane. Do we get to eat, and will there be another generation in our family? It's so interesting. There's no prophet, there's no priest, there's no vision, there's no voice from heaven. Right. It's God's people living out the gospel and how they treat each other, and it's just phenomenal. But it's just as ordinary as going to the grocery store or filling your tank of gas or mowing your neighbor's lawn. Yes. God works through everything. It's not just, writing books or preaching sermons in churches or going to the mission field. It's sharing a moment with somebody who's lonely. It's, sharing a sandwich with somebody who's hungry. Yeah. It's about listening to somebody who's grieving and just being with them. I mean, God works through everything. Mm-hmm. And the part I love about the book of Ruth is that they never knew.
Yes.
And we think, I've met with, and my father was one of these, but some of the men who have ministered to me and taught me spiritually, when they became elderly, the phone quit ringing, they stopped getting invitations to preach, and they felt like God wasn't using them anymore. And I'm thinking, well, first of all, we're all out here and you've equipped us. Mm-hmm. But also, God is using somebody in the book of Ruth who's just trying to feed her mother-in-law.
Yeah.
And the purposes of God are moving forward for the whole world through what she's doing. And, I love to think about that because, you have no idea how many people are blessed by your podcast. You have no idea. Or where something you say goes from one of them to somebody else. We don't know what God is doing. And no matter what we think he is doing, we've underestimated him. And he can use the least likely person, a woman from Moab,
yeah.
A pagan woman from Moab who wouldn't obey her mother-in-law and, was just frustrating. She was God's pick.
Yeah.
And she was the one, that he used to trigger everything that happened. I mean, I take great encouragement from that, that we may think the big names are the ones that God is using, to accomplish great things in the world, but it may be some immigrant, squeezing over the border, or it may be some person who's, just hoping somebody will throw a coin in the cup that they've got in front of them. It may be that person. We don't know.
Yeah, we the one thing that is certain that Jesus has made very clear is on the day when all things are revealed, there are going to be a lot of surprises. And a lot of the people who thought they accomplished the most for the kingdom are going to be surprised. And people who didn't think they didn't do anything are going to be surprised as well. And God's standard is, Ruth is a great book for that lesson and giving people the hope that they need when they, like you say about Naomi, when she's at ground zero and just feels like everything is done, life is done, there's nothing left. And she's not a young lady, and she's lost everything. And so from a worldly perspective, the first chapter of Ruth would be the end of her story. Absolutely. And yet it becomes the beginning. So we could talk about Ruth all day. And I think people, if you haven't viewers who are watching this, and maybe you're not familiar with Ruth as familiar, and so you're like, wait a minute, I don't remember these scenes or this. It's 4 chapters. Go read the book again, but read it with Carolyn's book, Gospel of Ruth, as kind of a guide. And then tell me about the newest book and what's different about that than Gospel of Ruth.
Oh my goodness. Okay, this book is I was asked to write another book about the book of Ruth, and there's just more to say. Mm-hmm. By the time I started writing this book, we were having problems with refugees and immigrants. Well, Naomi is a refugee. Her family, they are famine refugees. That's what our world is full of today. Mm-hmm. And Ruth is an immigrant. She's an undocumented immigrant. Mm-hmm. She has no right to be in Bethlehem. And, she has no legal rights as a woman in the patriarchal world. And so there's a chapter in here about refugees.
And real quick, the name of the book, show the book cover just so they can see it.
Finding God in the margins. And that's like saying, you think God's working in the big steeple places.
Right.
He's working in the margins. And one of the chapters in this that I love and that you will love, I think, is called The Manly Side of the Story. Mm-hmm. Because commentaries think that the men are out of the story in the first 5 verses. But those men, Elimelech and his 2 sons, are in every chapter of this book. And the rescue that is being implemented by Ruth to produce a son is to rescue them, because they haven't left a male heir, and she's producing one for them. Mm-hmm. So, when Samuel goes to anoint King David, he goes to Elimelech's land, which is what Obed and Jesse and his 7 sons inherited. And Boaz he's the father of them all, but that's not his property. That's not where his sons have lived. The men are all through it, and they're very important to the story. And, God doesn't play favorites. He calls his daughters to kingdom work, and he calls his sons to kingdom work, and he calls them to do it together. Yeah. So it's not an either or, and like we've turned it into in our own culture, it's not. And God breaks those rules himself.
Yeah, and we get clues of this throughout Scripture, Old and New Testament, of God setting there being norms in cultures and societies, and then Scripture has this funny way of always something popping up that puts a wrinkle in those cultural norms. And so, example of Ruth, that's a huge example. A Gentile, a Moabite. Moabites were forbidden in Deuteronomy. Moabites shall not enter the assembly of the people. And yet, God brings who? A Moabite in to be the heir, or the great-grandmother of the king of Israel, King David. So there are these little hints throughout Scripture of God subverting these things that are taken for granted. One of them in your book, and we've talked about here at the dojo and in the Superhero Seminary video, is the term Ezer, the Hebrew word that gets translated, I think, atrociously translated as helper or helpmate. I think those are horrendously chosen English words. They may have been fine in the 1600s, but they do not mean in modern English what the Hebrew word Ezer actually means. And so I wanted to, before me, because I want you, not me, to tell what I think, but how do you think that term, because you have a section on it, how do you think that term is best, if not translated, how do you think it best explained to people who have been told all their life, you're a woman, you got to be a helper. Be a good helper, let the husband lead, let the man do what needs to be done, and you just come along and help him. How do you explain this term to them?
Well, that came out in the very first book I wrote. I didn't get married right after college. I had a decade of singleness, and I always felt like when that passage, when Genesis 2 was being taught, which is where the word Ezer shows up, that I was out of that conversation because I wasn't a wife. Mm-hmm. And I went back to that text to ask the question, is God creating the woman, or is he creating a wife? It doesn't talk about marriage until the very end of that chapter, when it applies that text to marriage in a very anti-patriarchal statement, when it says, for this cause, a man will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. But under patriarchy, the wife becomes the property of her husband's family. And it works that way still today in patriarchal cultures. So, already the roots of patriarchy are being yanked up. But when I looked at that word, my father taught me that the Ezer was a spiritual helper. And so that was where I started. But I went back at it and I looked at it and I thought, you know what, this is the creation of the female. And so it ought to include us from our first breath to our final breath. Not just a certain season of life. When my mother is widowed, she's no longer an Ezer. Or, if someone never marries, she's not an Ezer. This is the name God gave his daughters. And it's a word that's used all the way through the Old Testament. And as a noun, 21 times. It's used 3 times for nations that Israel is seeking military aid from. They're being overpowered and they need help. And 16 times it's used for God as the Ezer of his people. And the remaining 2 times it's used for the woman in Genesis 2. And I looked up the word, and in other forms, it's used always in a military sense. And even Robert Alter thinks that this is a military term. Send your armies, we're being attacked. When they're calling on God to help them, they're not just asking for him to be gentle with them. They want help. Right. They need to be rescued. Their enemies are violent and dangerous and vicious. The Garden of Eden was also a war zone. There was an enemy getting ready to attack. What do you call that? And I concluded from that the Ezer is a warrior, and that she is called to stand in the battle for God's kingdom alongside her brother. And that's what you see in the book of Ruth. And that's what you see when Mary of Bethany anoints Jesus for his burial. He says that's what she's doing. She got his mission, and she stood with him in that battle. And you see it over and over and over again in the Bible, where a woman steps up onto the pages of Scripture and God works through her. Deborah and Barak and Jael, that is a blessed alliance of God's image bearers, and they're all in the same battle doing what God calls them to do. And Ezer is my Pennsylvania license plate.
Oh, nice.
Because I like that stamped on the back of me wherever I go, because I have responsibility, and the teaching that women need to hold back and they need to be quiet and they shouldn't do this or that. When I stand before Jesus, nobody's going to be standing there with me saying, well, we told her not to do that. I don't want to be explaining why I did too little. I have responsibility for what opportunities and privileges that God gives me and what gifts he gives me. And, I think we're called. I think Genesis 1 and 2 trumps all the other texts in scriptures, that God called his sons and daughters to stand together to look after things in the world on his behalf and to be actual reflections of his character, that we participate as image bearers in divine revelation. So, I'm not asking anybody to hold back. And I've got little girls in middle school who are riled up to stand up for what God is doing and to look after their friends and to be kind and to be generous. And, and elderly women who say, I thought my story was over and that I was finished, but God has more for me to do. I love that. So, and it's not a war against our brothers. We want them to be strong and we want them to do what God is calling them to do. So it's not a competition.
Yeah. I think when it comes to transit, because I've thought a lot about how to translate Ezer and when I teach on it and how to make people understand and get rid of the English baggage that the word helper has. We think hamburger helper. It's not the main thing. It helps the hamburger. It's hamburger helper. That's not what God has called women to be. They're not man helper. They're Ezer. And the point you made, I want to make sure viewers catch this. Ezer, other than the Genesis passage, it is never used in a way that's either not describing military aid or not talking about God and how he helps Israel. So whatever you think helper means, it has to apply to that concept. As I like the word ally, or something that connotes, like you said, teammate. People.
An alliance is what the language I use is the blessed in Genesis 1 that God calls male and female to an alliance that he blesses. It's a blessed alliance. It's a kingdom strategy that the enemy dismantled. Yes,
because he gave them the creation mandate was go and have dominion, subdue, fill the earth and subdue it. And so then there's a need for a coming battle, and it's hinted at even in Genesis 1, fill the earth and subdue it. Well, you don't subdue something unless there's going to be a struggle. And so then Genesis 2, we see this subduing it is not going to be, at least intended to be, a solo act. It's going to be male and female because both are the imago Dei. Both are the image of God. Male and female, he created them. The parallelism in the Hebrew is clear that male and female is referring to the image of God. So that's how Genesis 1 and 2 complement each other. And Ruth, I think, is not the only example. You mentioned some, and in the Old Testament, we think of Deborah, like you said, but also people like Phoebe and the litany of women that Paul thanks and greets at the end of Romans. So the fact that Jesus appears to the women first, whose testimony wouldn't be held up in a court, and says, now you go tell my disciples. So his disciples would have to take the voice of women, even if a courtroom wouldn't.
I think one of the funniest texts in the Bible comes when the Apostle Paul is on his missionary journey and he gets interrupted by a vision to go to Macedonia. And a man is the spokesman in that vision, and he goes to Macedonia and he can't find any believers in the synagogue, and he goes to a place of prayer, and what he ends up finding is a group of praying women, and he sits down. This is the former religious terrorist, the anti-Christian, the killer, sits down and leads a women's Bible study. And when he writes to the Philippian church, he says, I thank God every time I remember you for your partnership in the gospel from the first day. From the first day, it was his partnership with women. They were the first church planters in Europe was Paul and a group of women. And and it's so funny because translations and commentaries, they completely miss that, but it's right there. And I love it because what would he be expecting after a vision with a big stadium full of people breathlessly waiting for his message? But it's a group of women, Gentile women.
That's another example. It's just one of those ways the Bible just will subvert. It's almost like Scripture delights in subverting, just like Jesus did, delights in subverting
Yes.
our cultural expectations. Well,
Yes.
I want to keep this moving because we're having a great discussion, and I want to get to speaking of cultural subversion. So your new book, Maelstrom, and it is not spelled Maelstrom like the word, but Male, Maelstrom. So I want
Play on
you
words.
tell us about the book and how you see what like your goal in writing it and how it intersects with recent popular work like Jesus and John Wayne. What just
First
make
came,
us open
yeah.
us up to the book. Go for it.
It first came out in 2015, and it was the last book that I've written so far. It was, I was drawn to it by two things. One was that I was running, as I was studying women in the Bible, I kept running into men who get overlooked, whose stories are breathtaking, like Judah, Jacob's fourth son, who's a monster in the story. He really is just an awful man. And you have Barak in the story with Deborah in jail, and everybody beats up Barak, says he's a wimp, and he has to, can't depend on women. He's a fraidy cat. And, then you have Joseph, who marries Mary, but is going to put his life behind supporting his wife's calling. These stories that sort of break the rules and that we don't know quite what to do with. And what I saw in their stories was a different kind of masculinity than what patriarchy promotes, the power over others. Instead, it's a different way of living. It's a gospel brand of masculinity that reflects Jesus. They end up doing that. And the other thing that drew me was that it was at the time when ISIS was, scaring the daylights out of all of us. And there were young men from Western countries, including the United States, who were signing up for ISIS. And the experts who were studying that movement were saying that they were drawn to ISIS because they were longing for a sense of meaning, purpose, and belonging. And I said to myself, where are we in that conversation? And why aren't we drawing them? And so I started to write these stories. And what I realized in the very first beginning of it all was that I was writing about patriarchy and the damage that it does. And for example, in the book of Genesis, what patriarchy does is it gives special privileges, like crown prince privileges, to a man's firstborn son. And brothers in the book of Genesis are killing each other over that. Cain kills Abel. Ishmael is driven out.
Esau wants to kill Jacob.
Yeah, by rights of Isaac. And Esau wants to kill Jacob, and Jacob has to run for his life. When it comes to Jacob's sons, it's all out war because it's not Leah's sons, it's Rachel's son, Jacob's 11th son, who is being treated as the firstborn son. And he does get the double inheritance. There are 2 tribal territories that his descendants take ownership of. And it's Walter Brueggemann calls it the linchpin of patriarchy, primogeniture, the rights of the firstborn. And by the time you get to the end of the book of Genesis, they're killing each other over it, and it's destroying their families, and it's ruining relationships, and it's it's leading to criminal activity, you know, and it's like, this is a destructive force. This is not what you see in Genesis 1 at all, that we're called to care for creation and to look after it on as God's agents. Instead, it's about power, and we want power, and we want it over others, and we're willing to kill our brothers or traffic them into slavery in order to get that power. And I came to the conclusion that patriarchy is not the Bible's message. It's the backdrop to the Bible's message. And that when you put patriarchy behind these stories, these narratives in the Bible, the power just leaps off the page. And I'll give you a really simple example of this. When Mary of Bethany sits at the feet of Rabbi Jesus, her sister is offended that she is not helping out in preparing a meal for a big crowd. And, you know, it's the rules are being broken here. And Jesus says she has chosen what matters most, and it won't be taken away from her. And when preachers come to that text, they are at a loss to make a big deal out of it. You know, they talk about being too busy or not doing your quiet time or blah, blah, blah. Well, take that story to Pakistan or to Afghanistan and show that to the girls there. They'll tell you what Jesus is doing, and they'll also love him for what he does for women and girls by saying, you need to learn just as the men need to learn. I mean, it's just, it's radical. And when we read it, you know, we just make sap out of it. We really do. So
Martha's just too busy, and Mary has a good devotional life. And you're exactly right. It becomes, we read everything through our own lens. And I think every culture is guilty of that. You know, every culture, we all have lenses. And so the goal of good biblical interpretation is to show us what our lenses are and then help us to put on the other lenses that the original readers would have read it through. And when we do, I think you're exactly right. Now, let me ask you this, though, because we've used the term patriarchy numerous times in this episode so far. Some people watching this may not have ever heard the term. Other people watching this may have heard the term and have it means something completely different to them. So how are you defining and using the term patriarchy versus maybe how other cultural movements, non-Christian outside the church, how they might use the term patriarchy, and is there any difference?
Well, I think culturally it's, you know, it's worldwide. It's worldwide. It's like a shocking moment if a woman becomes prime minister of her country. You know, it's like, whoa, you know, well, this is just an exception to the rule or something. But it's, you know, it's God's intention that both his sons and daughters would do his work in the world, and that they would be stronger if they did it together than if they did it separately. When we had the 2008 financial crisis, some of the economic experts were saying, would we be in the same boat if it had been Lehman Brothers and Sisters instead of just Lehman Brothers? Because different decisions get made when you have more interaction and different perspectives, and, you know, more than gender, and even different racial or cultural perspectives. But, you know, I think patriarchy it's not God's intention for any of us to have power over others. We're empowered to take care of things, to look after things on his behalf, and to reflect his heart for the world in how we do that. And, you know, I find in my ministry, I run into some of the most extraordinary men in how they are empowering others around them and valuing the input of other people. And they're strong. And I like I said about Boaz, he did not shed his male power and privilege. He used it, but he didn't use it in selfish ways.
Mm-hmm.
And his back was against the wall because it was costly for him. It was a losing gamble for him that the nearer Redeemer wasn't willing to risk. And but he stands tall as a true man,
Mm-hmm.
for how he lived. And there are others like him in Scripture. I think Joseph in Matthew's Gospel is just incredible. And Barak is facing a David and Goliath battle, and he wants to know if God's in the battle. And the message to him from God is, if I want to win this battle against this Putin of your time, I can do it with a woman by herself. So it's about the real hero of the story, who is God.
Tell me, maybe I want to get your thoughts on this. What I see observing cultural discussions surrounding patriarchy, and this bleeds into a lot of like pop culture. I mean, you see, I'm a superhero comic nerd and all the Marvel movies and stuff. There is a controversy among, like, I'm going to use comic book movies because that's one example that I can think of, where but it's in like the Star Wars movies and the Marvel movies and everything. There are some properties, some shows that have strong women in powerful positions that are well written and that are great, and everybody seems to kind of like Mandalorian is a great example. One of the number of the characters are these strong, literally and emotionally strong women, but they don't take anything away from the male characters like Mandalorian and the others. And people seem to even like the most toxic misogynist nerd culture seems to really like that. But then you have other times where it's almost as if other creators think, okay, for the women to be strong in this movie or this show, there has to be a moment where they undercut the man. And they have to make the man bring the man down a peg, so that the woman can be brought up a peg. And there's a new show about She-Hulk, and there's some controversy, like, is that what's happening there? And some people say yes, and some people say no, and that is neither here nor there. But it's a dynamic that I see as an observer, as a Christian observer, that there's a mistaken notion that in order to correct or subvert the patriarchy, which I think Scripture does do, I think you're absolutely right, that means you have to make men look incompetent. You have to do the Homer Simpson syndrome, where the man is the doofus dad that doesn't know how to do anything, and the wife is the beautiful, smart. I mean, every sitcom, this is the formula for. And people think, that's smashing the patriarchy. That's putting men in their place. Girl power, rawr. People, and I look at it and I go, that's not empowering women or men. That's worldly form of trying to take people down a peg because it's a zero-sum game. And what I hear you saying, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, is that in God's kingdom it's not a zero-sum game. It's a both-win game when both are lifted up together as strong leaders. But that runs contrary to our fallen culture, where it has been patriarchal in the sense that, yes, women are subservient and men do call the shots. Is that fair to say? Am I reading? What do you?
Oh, yeah. I think there's fear of, that men are demeaned through this. That's why I was so shocked by those stories that I wrote about in Malestrom, that these men aren't playing by patriarchy's rules. Mm-hmm. And their stories are breathtaking. Judah's story, when pastors come to Genesis 38, they tend to skip it. Because it's hard to preach to a G audience when you've got prostitution in
R-rated
the
material.
story. Yeah. but and it's also frustrating and I've been frustrated by this, when you're reading through Genesis and you get to Joseph is being sold into slavery and they're deceiving their father, and you want to know what is happening to Joseph. You want to go with Joseph, right. And instead you go with Judah, and it's sort of like, ooh, why are we doing this? We don't like him.
Yeah.
You know? But when he and there's a mistranslation in that text where Judah says she is more righteous than I. It's what he's saying. He's saying she is righteous, I am not. Mm-hmm. And it didn't make sense to the translators to say that, so they fixed it. And but he's saying she's righteous, I am not, and he's looking at himself in the mirror. Mm-hmm. And the man we see after that collision with Tamar is a different man. Mm-hmm. And when he faces the brother, when he realizes what's at stake and that Benjamin is now at risk, and he doesn't know he's talking to Joseph, but he talks about his father and his brother, and he's instead of fighting for the rights of firstborn, which it seems by his older brother's behavior, he's the one entitled to inherit. The way he talks, he's a different man. I mean, it makes me weep to read that. And you can't account for that change if you don't talk about what happened with Tamar, because she confronted him with himself. Mm-hmm. And with his responsibility to his sons. And she's blessed with the birth of 2 sons to replace 2 dead husbands when she delivers the child that he impregnated. It's 2.
Yeah. And she's another Gentile, I believe. She's another Gentile woman in the line of Jesus in Matthew's gospel.
That's right. And he says she is righteous. I am not. But then he offers himself for his little brother Benjamin, that his father he's now his father's favorite. Mm-hmm. So it's those are the kinds of stories that are in Malestrom, and these men, I love them, and they give us a vision of masculinity that is full of Jesus, even in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And it's about the true hero of the story, and they begin to reflect him more truly. I mean, 3 of the men in Malestrom should have been behind bars. Judah should have been, Matthew should have been, and the Apostle Paul, Saul of Tarsus, they all should have been in legal trouble for their crimes. They were criminal. They were criminals, and God reached out and changed them. Yeah. I mean, I love their stories. There's so much hope, and God loves his sons. Mm-hmm. And this is not a male bashing book. It's a book where the stories of men, and Jesus included, are just so powerful and so hope-filled, and so transforming. Mm-hmm.
Well, now, when you say this is not a male-bashing book, because that's the first thought many people have, men and women. I'm finding a lot of women who, when they hear the word patriarchy or feminism or anything, they don't want anything to do with it, because they start associating it with radical left-wing politics or with certain cultural movements. And so as Christians, and I deal with this a lot with my outreaches, I teach jiu-jitsu and self-defense to refugee kids here in Charlotte, a free week program. And because of all the reasons that we've talked about with Ruth and with Gentiles, and half of my students are girls, and so teaching them to be little Ezers and not just little princesses. But whenever I start talking about that work, people start say, oh, well, you must be, and then they'll just assign a socio-political stance and think that I'm that. So I have to constantly undermine that expectation that people have. So what are some ways that you try to reach men and women who do hear the word patriarchy through the lens of cable news, either for or against, and are not hearing it through what you want to be a gospel-centered or a scripture-focused way? How do you navigate that without being, I mean, we're always going to be misunderstood. How do you mitigate that misunderstanding as much as possible when you're trying to reach people?
Yeah. I had a seminary professor come to one of the conferences that I used to lead with women in ministry, women who wanted to be in ministry, and it wasn't about the gender debate. We were going to talk about our work and the challenges that we were facing, and so it was complementarians and egalitarians, and they were helping each other and forging friendships. But I just said when I started that, we're not doing that. We're tired of it. Mm-hmm. And if women want to be ordained, they know where they can go to be ordained, and they also know where it's never going to happen. But I want to call women to answer God's call in their life, whatever that is. And, I have to answer for myself. And I can't stop people who say, oh, you're just trying to be woke. Mm-hmm. Or, I have to do what I think is right. And my work is out in the public. And, this seminary professor who came to my conference was looking for, how he was going to cringe over what was being talked about. And he loved it. And he said, that's not happening here. And we shouldn't be berating our brothers. We're the Ezers. That's our job, is in part to champion them and how God is calling them. When I got married, one of the first things that my husband did was to call me to step up and do what God's calling me to do. Because I was raised to think, okay, we're doing him now. Mm-hmm. And he said, no, that's not how this works. But I have to say, I'm 100% behind him. Mm-hmm. I don't ever want him to feel alone. And I don't ever want him to hold back from what God is calling him to do, no matter how hard it is. And I have other male friends that I feel the same about. We can't afford to spare anyone. And if a man is thinking he can do it by himself, it's costing all of us, because he can do better if he joins ranks with the Ezers in his life. Mm-hmm. So, it's we need each other. And I'll say it again, it is God's kingdom strategy to divide men and women in the work God has called us to do. So, I mean, you've got women friends that you're engaged with, other female scholars that mm-hmm. you respect and learn from. And, what if you said, I don't need to learn from you? But you're not doing that. Yeah, you're not doing that. And there are, like I've said, there are plenty of blind spots in Scripture that we do not see because our view is limited. One of the first eye-opening moments for me was when I heard a deaf man preach on Jesus' healing of a deaf man. Mm. And there were things that he noticed about that exchange that you don't notice if you can hear. Because Jesus takes the man away from the crowd. He looks up to heaven and he sighs. Mm-hmm. He touches the man's ears and his tongue. He's signing. It's not just this is the particular tactic for this particular ailment. is that he's talking to the man who can't hear him.
Hmm.
And this man was preaching that. So it was amazing, you know, because there were things that I just never saw.
That's another, that's an example of the lenses that we have that we aren't even aware of.
It's rich.
Yeah,
it
absolutely. That's an ongoing challenge that we who do biblical education face, is getting people to see through not just the ancient lenses, but also how different modern lenses affect how we read or how we view scripture. It's one of the reasons that why, you know, at Disciple Dojo we try to amplify the voices of non-traditional outlets that are in an evangelical sense. So for instance, I'm very big on amplifying the voice of my friends who are Palestinian. I've spent time in Palestine among Palestinian Christians, and it's not a perspective that people in America typically get for political and for theological reasons. And it's not because I think that that's the true voice that everybody needs to hear, but it's because that is a valid voice that will make our cultural blind spots more aware. And then we can, if we choose to engage and disagree with a point, or same thing with a female scholar, colleagues and friends of mine who are females, I don't look at it like, I need to say that I need to push this person in front of everybody because it's a woman. I'm like, well, no, I need to push this person because she's a phenomenal scholar, and people need to see women who are phenomenal scholars so that it's not seen as weird or abnormal, but it's seen as, oh, that's a valid calling too, and they're going to have insight that I didn't have as a man. And that's how we have to be listening to the ears of other people. It applies with I see it in friends that are white that get real nervous around conversations of race and ethnicity and social justice. There's some people call it white fragility. Some people have called it, I like the term white normality, is people think that just is normal. You have the normal world, which is a white world, and then you have all the other exotic, even if they love it, it's still weird and exotic and other. And I think that in and of itself needs to be undermined and eroded. But we have a tendency, we have a knee-jerk reaction against things sometimes because of the baggage that gets attached. And I know people who, if I even put the word patriarchy in the title of this video, I know some self-professing evangelical Christians who will watch this entire discussion through the lens of, oh, these are two woke Democrats talking about left-wing politics. And we're not even touching on any of those things, but they'll view it through that lens.
Yeah.
And it's such a shame. I don't think there's anything you can do. I think you can't change how somebody's going to respond to what you're saying. You can just try to be as clear as you can in what you're saying. And if they hear something you're not saying, that's on them.
Yeah. Well, when I sat in that class and heard Bruce Waltke talk about the book of Ruth, I have to tell you, I sobbed all the way home. I thought, what have I been doing with my life? Thinking that somebody's supposed to take care of me, or that I'm supposed to do, well, my mom said it, you will follow your husband. And, I was just glad for the heads up because it matters to me where he's going, Yeah. But it was over for me. The whole debate about women was over at that point, because I just thought, I have responsibility. This is not a free ride for me. And, what does it mean to be an Ezer in Ukraine today? Who's going to take care of you, right? No, they're making bombs. The Ezers over there. We need to stress test our theology by a global perspective. Yeah. Your Palestinian friends are important to our understanding of Scripture because it's a global message, and we are the ends of the earth. This is the last frontier for the gospel. We act like we invented it, but we didn't. We are latecomers and foreigners to the world of the Bible. So we need all the help we can get. And your Palestinian friends can inform you. And I think, again, patriarchy matters because it's the fallen cultural backdrop of the Bible's message. And it just ignites a fire when you start to see that, because it's, like for me, I saw these men in these stories, they're violating patriarchy. You don't give your life for the youngest son. And, and God is always choosing the wrong one. He chooses son number 2 over and over and over again in Genesis. And then he chooses number 4, because he does choose Judah. But Jacob chooses 11. But God doesn't play by primogeniture's rule. He does not, he violates it himself. And it happens again and again and again. And then sometimes he chooses a woman.
Yeah. Well, now this is and viewers don't know this, but this whole discussion that we set up came from a Facebook interaction and a Facebook post where you shared something, and I won't leave. If you want to share it, you can. But you shared something by a Christian leader that was basically arguing, and it's a Christian leader that's in my neighborhood, by the way, lives not too far from here. And you shared a quote. We actually went to seminary together, and it was. The Christian, this pastor was saying patriarchy is not wrong. It's sinful patriarchy is the problem. Christian patriarchy is what God wants. And he comes from a tradition that is very much of the mindset that God instilled patriarchy. It's not a result of the fall. It's just been distorted. But patriarchy itself is the good thing. You seem to take the view that no, patriarchy is the social reality that God stepped into to start undermining and turning people away from it, and so that it is wholly a result of the fall. It's Genesis 3, not Genesis 1 and 2. That seems to be where you're coming from. And I saw that post and was reached out and said, hey, do you want to talk about this on an episode? I think it'd be pretty interesting. So how do you respond to that idea that is popular among, I'm not complementarian. I don't know if I say I'm egalitarian, because I think I see some issues with everybody that I'm still parsing out what I think is the best label, but I am not complementarian. I do believe women, every spiritual gift that God gives to men in the church, God also can and has called women to. So how do you respond to our brothers and sisters who are on that side and who say, oh, patriarchy is good, you just have to do it right. It needs to be loving and benevolent.
Well, it's one of the things I argue in Malestrom is that the definition of manhood that gets argued for is out of reach for a lot of men. It's not a birthright. You have to earn it. And Jesus didn't follow those rules, and Paul didn't follow those rules. They never married. They never produced sons. They took support. They received support from women, financial support. It's all backwards in their stories. They didn't follow those rules. And these are really arbitrary categories that are set up to maintain the status quo. And I've had male friends who were paralyzed. How are they going to protect? How are they going to, and men who are physically incapable of earning a living, or the wife is the one who's the breadwinner, and that's what's blessing their family and blessing him. And I believe that true manhood is a birthright, that you are born to reflect your Creator. That is your birthright. You are the Imago Dei. And you can violate that, you can ignore it, but you can't get away from it. That's what you're called to be and do. And you don't have power over other people. The creation narrative does not give power over any other person. And it doesn't give it to men, and it doesn't give it to women. The power is God's to rule creation. And we are his agents. We reflect his heart. We're not in this to dominate anybody. And I'll tell you what, and you can clip this out if you want to. But it really, for a lot of women, and I include myself in this, was horrifying to see complementarian leaders support Donald Trump after the Access Hollywood tape release. Mm-hmm. And their mantra is to protect women. And some egalitarians have failed miserably at that too. Yeah. Which is why I think this whole discussion is very inadequate for what God calls us to be and do. Mm. But it's, that was horrifying to me. Yeah. And, don't talk to me about protecting women. Yeah. That's not protecting women.
Yeah, I gained, Carmen and I talked about this on the first episode. I had always been kind of ambivalent towards Beth Moore. I just never really interacted much with her or engaged with her teachings very much. I would kind of review some of her material when I was on staff at church for small groups and things, but I never really paid a lot of attention to her, for good or for ill. I just didn't. And when she started getting the major flack for being one of those after that incident, stepping up and saying, this is unacceptable, that's when my respect started ratcheting up, and I started paying attention to her more and listening to more of what she said, and have been really pleasantly surprised, because I think it is baffling to me how people, exactly what you said, this is not about how somebody votes. I don't care how somebody votes. Everybody that follows me on Facebook knows my politics are, not Republican or Democrat, but the rushing to defend or excuse something that is indefensible and inexcusable because of tribal political allegiance. It showed to me an idolatry among Christians, and it's still there. I think it's a deep idolatry among Christians.
Well, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. It comes up all the time with women who are believers and women who are not. And, it's politics are flawed. Mm-hmm. Our government leaders are all flawed. But I think when something comes out of that nature, when at the same time we have Church 2 going on and all of these scandals emerging, we've got major problems. And, you can talk patriarchy all you want, but there is a real consequence for wanting that. I mean, it's Jesus doesn't call us to any social system. He doesn't call us to any social governmental way. We are citizens of the kingdom of God. Yeah. And it's a different kingdom. Mm-hmm. It's Ruth and Boaz and Naomi thinking about the needs of others and making huge sacrifices because of others and what others need. And it's Jesus. Yeah. And Jesus isn't represented by Republicans or Democrats or independents for that matter. No. It's not of this world. It's a kingdom that is not of this world. And all of us have to struggle to enter into that kingdom because all of us are rooted in a fallen world. Yeah. So, we've all got more to learn,
And we have to live that kingdom out in this world. And because of our finite grasp of everything, we are going to inherently have disagreements among Christians about how to best live out that kingdom in this fallen world. And so Christians, I think Christians are always going to have political disagreements. I think we're always going to have disagreements on policy and on social issues and on cultural issues.
Yeah.
But where we can find commonality is we can say our desire, we want the same end, and our authority and our what is empowering us is the same source. And so in the meantime, how do we navigate our disagreements that become genuine disagreements without the rancor and the infestation of the idolatry that politics has become for America in general, and not just America, I mean all over the world.
Yeah.
It's definitely a challenge. I appreciate that you are tackling this issue head on. I love on your social media, you're not afraid to engage and to be specific and pointed, not in a, at least that I've seen, a combative way and an acerbic way, but in a way that's like, okay, let's get this out and talk about it. I'm going to say what I think, and I think this is something that we as a church need to talk about together. That's exactly what these discussions and these episodes are for as well, is to do just that.
Well, kudos to you for doing that. You know, we've got a lot to learn. We all have a lot to learn, and, you know, and I want to learn. It's unnerving, you know, when you've been thinking a certain way your whole life, and then all of a sudden you find out, oh my goodness, what have I been thinking?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that challenging our whole life thinking is always a good thing. You know, the always reforming mindset of what should be Reformation. And it's something that people who pride themselves on being Reformation Christians don't always do. It's kind of like, okay, I've reformed and that's it. And now anything that challenges that, I've got to push back and contend for the faith and guard against the wolves that are trying to get into among the sheep. And so whether it's patriarchy, whether it's, you know, any cultural hot button issue, that's kind of, you're going to get that people riled up because they can't disentangle the issues from the core of the gospel and see that degree of charity that we need to be able to give one another. But part of it's biblical. I mean, before we go, we're coming up on around 2 hours, so I want to be mindful of your time. And one of the key passages that comes up in any discussion of male-female relationships is the passage in 1 Timothy 2 about women and how Paul wants them to dress modestly, not elaborate, and then also about how they are to learn in silence, and he does not permit a woman to, and then there's question about what he's actually saying in that verse. The reason I bring this up to you, I'd like to hear how you approach that passage in general, because when I do, one of the things Disciple Dojo does on our channel, we review study Bibles. And I review the different study Bibles on the market, and I look at key passages where you are going to find differences depending on what study Bible you're using. And so 1 Timothy 2 is one that I almost always include because that will be a lightning rod passage, and it'll also give you a good idea of where that study Bible editorial board is coming from. So how do you deal with the passage in 1 Timothy 2 about women? Well, the modesty thing we can talk about if you want to, but I'm more interested in how you approach it, because you are a woman, you are teaching, you are not learning in silence at home, you are actually speaking and writing and heading, you know, I think you're adjunct seminary professor, and you do all of these things. So, Carolyn, why are you not following the Bible? Would be the question you're going to get.
You know, well, I'll say, this is where I've landed. And a couple of things. First, for me, the definitive passage is Genesis 1. And that's the vision that God has for creation. And that's what we lost at the fall. That's what Jesus came to restore. When I look at Paul, it seems a little strange to me that when we come to deciding what women can or can't do, that we leap over the whole rest of the Bible and land in 1 Timothy, that this is the governing text for what women can or can't do. When Paul himself is already, working with women, women are on his team, they are indispensable to his ministry. It's so I'm sticking with Genesis 1 that calls me to responsibility, that calls me to use my opportunities and privileges before the Lord to serve him. And what I think Paul is doing is taking Jesus into the first century. And when you read Acts and Paul's letters, you see that they're figuring it out. How does Gentiles, how do we do this? Do they become Jews? They were struggling to figure that all out. And our job is to take Jesus into the 21st century. And we have new questions that they weren't asking then. And we have to struggle like they struggled. Because we are, and this is a culture where all kinds of things have, women in the workplace, women as the breadwinner, women who are single. If you were single, well, they would marry you off. Even Ruth's father married her off to a famine refugee. That wasn't exactly a marriage that was going to bless their family and increase their status. That he's offloading her to do that. But under patriarchy, you get married, they'll marry you off to somebody, and maybe that somebody's got 3 other wives, but the more wives, the more offspring you can have. And I just think our challenge is to take the gospel into the 21st century, where we're asking questions about marriage and marital rights and abortion and women in leadership positions and as heads of corporations, and that women are professors in universities, and it's a different world. I mean, for me, the first time I ever spoke to a group where men were present was at a women's conference, when I looked up at this window up high in the wall, and there was a man in the sound booth, and I thought, now what am I supposed to do? Yeah. So I figured it's his responsibility. I'm not going to take it for him. But, that was when I was sort of leaning in that direction, that it's okay to speak to groups of women. But men started coming. So what do you do? Or they'll
so you grew up or were raised in what would be complementarian?
Oh, very, very much so.
Yeah.
Totally different rules, and that's a whole nother story.
I'm sure. Well, it's interesting to me. I was raised and still am Methodist, not United Methodist. We are in the process of ununiting at the moment, but I have always been Wesleyan evangelical, and so women and my dad's a pastor. My mom is a strong woman, and I always saw marriage modeled as teamwork, as two, they were something. Dad was good at these things, mom was good at these things, so if it was a decision that needed to be made and it was in his area, that's where we went. If it was in her area, that's where we went, because who else is going to, So when I talk with complementarian friends, I'm like, okay, this is interesting. I don't have that background or that upbringing. But that doesn't mean that when I hear egalitarian friends and some of the things they say, I'm like, wait a minute, time out. Like, you're not being fair to the biblical text either, because you're kind of just saying, well, they don't know what they're talking about, and we have all the answers now. And so I find myself going, what you said, Paul taking Jesus in the first century, I think that's right. Paul taking the gospel, the New Testament letters are how do you live out the gospel in the Greco-Roman first century?
Well, or how would you talk to the women in Afghanistan under the Taliban? Wouldn't you tell them to cover up? I mean, I wouldn't want anybody to get treated like they do get treated when they, I mean,
Yeah, for their safety, for logistic reasons,
right.
and their cultural reasons.
You would tell them to listen. You need to listen so you'll learn.
Right.
And, I think a lot of it is a call to learning. And that was not, they were not educating their daughters. They're not doing that in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
This is what patriarchy does. It says boys matter, girls don't. And they're going to go to another family and produce sons for somebody else. They're not going to help us. So it's, I think that we have new issues to address, and we need to be fearless in addressing them and in challenging the gospel to help us in how we navigate in the 21st century. Things are different now.
Well, in First Timothy 2 is a perfect example in the verse right before the verse about teaching and how we look at it as Americans rather than ancient Greco-Roman audience, because I just had this discussion the other day in an online group with Christian singles where the issue was about dressing modestly, and they said, the Bible says, for instance, women should dress modestly, and it is all I've found 100% of the time, not 99, 100% of the time, American evangelical Christians hear and read the command to dress modestly as Paul saying, don't dress sexually provocatively. When in reality, what Paul was specifically saying, if you finish the verse, is don't dress economically provocatively. In other words, don't dress with gold, pearls, elaborate hairstyles, rich clothing. He was talking about it because it wasn't a concern. Women weren't going around wearing halter tops and bikinis, and they were showing their status. And so I find it incredibly ironic where you'll have a church where the pastor's wearing $900 sneakers or a $10,000 suit, and the women in the church have hats that cost more than my monthly income and dresses to the nine, and they'll condemn somebody who comes to church in pants rather than a skirt, or wears yoga pants when they go jogging, as being immodest. And I just think whether that is immodest or not, that has nothing to do with what Paul is talking about in that passage, which is what you are clearly violating with your wildly extravagant wardrobe in a church setting. And so I think, to me, that's a perfect example of how we look at ancient Near East text through a modern lens. And we just think, Paul's talking about modesty in the sexual sense. And don't get me wrong, viewer, I'm not saying Paul didn't care about that. And I think Paul would have words, and I think Jesus would too, if somebody did come to church in, a bikini or the sleek dress or what. I just don't think that's the issue in that passage that's being addressed. And I think the one that is being addressed is the very issue that many Christians are ignoring, because they just don't think it talks about that.
Economic disparities. Well, there are all kinds of walls that, and I love Paul, and I have to say there have been times when I haven't loved him. But, when I see the transformation in that man and how unbelievable it is, that not only does he say there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Gentile, slave or free, he lives it. He actually becomes a bridge that connects those in his own story. In his own story. When you think about, when he says, I'm the chief of sinners, I really think that he was always dogged by memories that he couldn't get out of his head, of the screams, of the, the things that he, we don't forget the wrong things we do. We don't forget, even though, Jesus has forgiven us. We don't forget that we're capable of doing really hurtful things. And, I love that about him. And then when you see how he changes and how it's beyond whatever you would imagine happening to him at conversion. You'd think, okay, now he's going to be, one of those that promotes circumcision or, but and I think we need to change more than we have.
Yeah, he definitely crosses the boundaries and
it's amazing.
Upsets the apple carts in a lot of ways. I do think Paul is probably the most misread author. Maybe John of Revelation might have him edged out in terms of most misinterpreted work, but I think Paul is certainly up there in terms of being the most misunderstood by so many people across the spectrum, because he's such a unique and an interesting figure, and because he was writing to such diverse congregations, audiences, settings.
And getting beaten.
Usually from jail.
They didn't call him woke. They just threw stones at him.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so before we go, I threw this out there, and viewers, followers on social media, I said, do you have any questions? We're going to have Carolyn Custis James on. And one of them is a good question, because you do deal with issues of male, female, and patriarchy. And they wanted to know what Bible translation that you prefer and you think is the most gender accurate for somebody who does care about these issues and may have misunderstood some passages because of translation issues.
Yeah.
What would you recommend?
It's a really difficult subject, because translating those ancient languages into English and for a modern audience, that some of the words don't make any sense to us. I know when I talked to one of the translators, they said, we're trying to make sure in texts that say brothers or brethren, or it talks about men as opposed to mankind. It's humanity that's intended, that readers can't make that adjustment and they feel left out. And as a woman, I would read scripture and I would think, is this talking to me? Or am I just overhearing what's being said to my brothers? And so I get that. That's a big problem. But so they've worked on these translations to make them clearer to a modern audience. So I use the TNIV. That's what I use the most. But I'm also part of this group. I'm on their advisory board. This is a new movement. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's the Institute for Bible Reading. And this is the New Living Translation, which I was thrilled when it came out at first, because it was hard to read the Bible to my daughter when it wasn't as clear as this is. So, and I recommend that for the average reader. It's going to be clearer in their lovely introductions before each book of the Bible.
And tell me about that Immerse project. Is it grouped by books of the Bible or by theme? Or that one's Messiah.
They've done the whole, their beginnings, their kingdoms and chronicles. Right. So it's a whole collection. This is Messiah is the New Testament.
Okay,
so
and is it all
the whole New Testament?
Okay, gotcha.
And the Old Testament is in 5 volumes.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, because they just, and churches are using this for book clubs, where they say, okay, let's do this together, and they'll read a book of the Bible, or they'll read it, and then they'll come together and they'll talk about it, and it's just reigniting the reading of Scripture. The other thing I want to say is the ESV, which has really taken over, is driven by the agenda to preserve the use of the word male. Mm-hmm. So when it says that God created man, then they want to leave it to say man. They don't want to say he created humanity or he created mankind. And it's kind of funny because there were a couple of places where I caught them. And one was, I used to say my favorite verse, and I can't think of the Psalm reference offhand, but it's a verse in the Psalms that says, all men are liars. And I used to use that to torment a young pastor in our church who used to say, women can't do this and women can't do that. And I say, do you want to hear my favorite verse? And then I would quote that one and he goes, oh, no. But it's funny because I thought, I'm going to see if the ESV backs me up and says all men are liars. And they don't. They say all mankind.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's another place in Galatians where they give away the farm, because the text says in Christ you are all sons. He's saying that to a mixed audience in a patriarchal culture. How do you think women heard that in the first century? You are all sons. You are all sons in God's family. And they keep that translation, and the other translations say you're all sons and daughters. That's not what Paul is saying. Right. And it is a revolutionary statement in the patriarchal world. You are all sons.
And in that instance, a literal translate, or not literal, but a word for word translation is needed to bring out the subversive. But it has to be explained to a modern audience, and that's why I keep saying we need to understand patriarchy, and we need to explain it when we use these stories or these letters, because it's radical. It is so radical, and they're not thinking it's radical. They're thinking it's preserving a male feel for their theology, but the Bible doesn't do that. Right.
And it's earth-shaking. So yeah.
When it comes to Bible translation is a fascinating topic. Mark Ward and I talked about this when he was on, and it's very fascinating. I try to tell people every translation has strengths, every translation has weaknesses, and that there's no perfect translation. You mentioned NLT, I think is good. The TNIV, for those who don't know, it's no longer in print, but the NIV 2011 is, for the most part, the TNIV. Yeah, they may have changed and tweaked a few things. And then the ESV, there are numerous editions. Some ESV readers don't even know that there are four different editions of the ESV. So the ESV you're reading from 2001 is going to be different than the ESV that you see on Bible Gateway or YouVersion or something right now. And every translation is done by flawed people. So as long as we're able to be charitable, but also be understanding that, no translation is going to be perfect. And the ESV is an overtly, this is not a, Carolyn, you're not slamming them by saying they are guided by this agenda. They say it in the preface, and the Committee on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, which kind of runs the ESV translation, or at least it was birthed from, they don't hide the fact it was done to be an alternative to the TNIV back during that little three-way Bible battle in the early 2000s between Holman Christian Standard, TNIV, and ESV, and they kind of each lined up their different Christian celebrity spokespeople, and so there was this little, I laugh because it's of all a tempest in a teapot. Like nobody except Bible nerds even knows about this, but I was in seminary when it was all unfolding, and I thought it was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are good. That's a good recommendation. I think NLT is a good one to recommend. I think NIV.
Oh, yeah. It's beautifully done. And there's always interpretation. I'm using that new version of the TNIV. I don't even have the old one, I don't think. But
Yeah.
anyway.
There's an interesting, for viewers that want to kind of go down the rabbit hole. None other than D.A. Carson, who's fairly complementarian and reformed, wrote a book on the whole Bible translation gender issue called The Inclusive Language Debate, A Plea for Realism, I think is the subtitle. And it is a very, very good book. It's very balanced, and he does do a good job of sharing these types of passages like that Carolyn mentioned and others, where is this talking about gender language, or is this talking about humanity language and just using male gender as a default, like when Jesus says, if any man would come after me, let him take up his cross and follow me. Does that mean that women can't take up their cross? So those are, I will put a link in the video description if people want to go deeper. I do recommend checking out that book if you really want to get into the weeds on it.
There's another one, Mark Strauss, and I think Gordon Fee wrote up, are the ones.
How to Choose a Translation for All It's Worth?
Yes, that's a really good book.
Yes, that's that's right behind me up here. It is. Well, Carol, we are about 2 hours now. So before we go, if anybody wants to contact you or reach you, I'm going to put your information in the video description along with the timestamps for people. But how would you tell viewers the best way to get in touch with you?
Well, I have a website that is CarolynCustisJames.com. I'm on Facebook and Twitter as Carolyn Ezer.
Okay.
So they should be able to find me there.
All right.
But there's a way to contact me on my website. Yes. So.
Okay. Perfect. Well, folks, thank you for watching this and for tuning in. I think I'm sure viewers, there are some who are pulling their hair out because we didn't go deep enough on a specific issue, and others who think, whoa, I've never heard that much about this issue, and all of the reactions. So whatever your comments are, feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I'll be happy to interact. But I want to make sure that viewers know the purpose of these dojo discussions. One, I want you to know who Carolyn is. A lot of times people are just names on pages or book covers, and we don't actually get to interact or understand who they are as people. And so being able to have Carolyn on and you to get to see who she is as an author and a little bit about her story, I want you to know who she is. And I wholeheartedly recommend, especially the Gospel of Ruth, because that's the one that was such a help to me in teaching Ruth to a popular audience and making the transition from commentary to Bible study. That was a wonderful resource, and so I wholeheartedly recommend you go check that out. I'm looking forward to reflecting and more and interacting with her findings in Malestrom, and so follow her on social media, check out her website, and go get a copy of those books and see what you think, because this is not to tell you what to think. In a dojo, you don't come into a dojo and get told what to do. You come into a dojo to spar. You come into a dojo to train, to get pushed, to get pulled. Maybe you get thrown, maybe you get swept. This is, as martial artists, that's what we go to dojos for. But in the process of going to a dojo, you learn and you grow and you get stronger. So that's what here at Disciple Dojo, this is a theological, biblical training center. So if you are watching this and you want to push back against something Carolyn said, maybe you think, no, I think you're wrong, you are free to share that in the comments section. As long as, like any dojo, it's done with respect and with the desire to better the other person, it's always welcome. So Carolyn, thank you so much for spending this afternoon, and I'm just tickled that you were here. So.
Thank you. That's so nice.
Once again, I want to thank Carolyn for joining us here at Disciple Dojo. I hope you found this conversation interesting. I know I did. Some of the topics we discussed probably raised more questions than answers for some of you. And so I'm going to put links in the video description below for where you can go deeper as you explore and parse out and figure out where you land on all of these issues that we've talked about. And if you haven't already, be sure to check out the other interviews we've done here at Disciple Dojo in our Dojo Discussions playlist. We've talked to some pretty interesting people here, and hopefully that will only continue in the future. Thanks for watching, and we will see you back here for another Dojo Discussion in the near future.